Ukraine's spiderweb attack was its biggest and most successful strike on Russia so far, reportedly dealing around $7 billion worth of damage and devastating a large part of the Russian bomber fleet. Russia is still reeling from the impact of that attack, but Ukraine isn't stopping there. It's keeping the pressure up and not giving the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, a single second of respite. In fact, the Ukrainian armed forces just launched another devastating drone strike that some are calling Spiderweb 2.0, and Russian analysts are, honestly, terrified of what might come next. Here's how the most recent attack unfolded. On Saturday, June 7th, a Russian locomotive was speeding along the tracks, transporting an array of tanks, armored vehicles, and other military equipment. Russia relies massively on these trains to fuel and maintain its war effort. The country has even constructed multiple new railway lines since the invasion began to speed up and streamline the flow of supplies, like ammo, fuel, and food. But this train was never going to reach its destination. Unknown to the Russians, Ukrainian forces had secretly hidden a small army of drones inside some of the railway containers. When the time was right, as the train was still moving, hatches on those containers opened up, and the drones burst into life, flying out and raining down fire on the train. It was in many ways a mirror image of the spiderweb attack, which saw drones hidden on board a series of trucks, which were then driven to key locations across Russia. Once the drones had parked up near the important Russian airfields, the container roofs opened up. Dozens of drones then filled the skies, damaging and destroying large numbers of Russian bombers that were parked up on the airfields. According to reports, up to a third of Russia's entire bomber fleet was wiped out, all in a single day, though the operation itself required a whopping 18 months of planning. There's no information on how Ukraine managed to sneak its drones on board a Russian train, but it was surely a feat of incredible intelligence, strategy, and stealth. Since these trains are so important to Russia, they tend to be heavily protected, with Russian forces going to great lengths to safeguard their supplies as they move from place to place, with the likes of cameras, guards, and various technologies employed in key locations like ports, stations, and bases. So the fact that Ukraine pulled this off is quite extraordinary, and it's even more impressive to learn that Ukraine must have somehow discovered the existence of a train that was set to carry both military hardware and grain containers, and to then develop a strategy of smuggling its drones into those grain containers, and finding a way to release them at just the right moment for a successful and devastating strike. In short, just like Operation Spiderweb, this attack was an astonishing example of Ukrainian ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. While there aren't yet many details about how the attack was planned and carried out, it has been confirmed by sources on both sides of the divide. And, if reports are to be believed, it was an incredibly destructive and successful strike. The defense forces of southern Ukraine, for example, posted about the attack on Telegram on June 7th as part of their daily updates on key events from the front lines. They wrote, "The defense forces of southern Ukraine hit a locomotive with a column of enemy equipment. The enemy's losses amounted to 13 tanks and more than 100 units of armored and automotive equipment." On X, the American independent war reporter Igor Sushko appeared to confirm the news, writing, "Ukrainian drones flew out of grain train car hatches and destroyed 13 Russian tanks, and more than 100 armored vehicles and other equipment being transported by the Russian train in occupied southern Ukraine. The hatches appear to have been opened remotely, again." Other news sources paint an even grimmer picture for Russia, suggesting that, as well as more than a dozen tanks and over 100 armored vehicles, the drone strike also took out 7 artillery systems and 10 fuel tanks, carrying anywhere from 158,000 to 172,000 gallons of fuel. Of course, there is always the possibility that Ukraine's armed forces and other sources are exaggerating these claims somewhat to make the attack appear even more successful. However, even reports from the Russian side of the war paint a damning picture of the attack, with one pro-Kremlin blogger in particular expressing absolute outrage that the attack was allowed to take place. He allegedly wrote, "There is no point in remaining silent anymore. The enemy destroyed a locomotive with tanks and dozens of armored vehicles. At some point, hatches through which grain is poured began to fly off from railway containers, such as hoppers, while they were moving. It was through them that drones flew out and attacked the equipment that was located on the platform cars. What genius came up with the idea of combining a train of equipment with grain trucks is a mystery, as well as how the SBU managed to hide drones there is also unknown. But the result was this. The first blow was delivered to the locomotive, after which the train began to lose speed and was stopped. The enemy destroyed most of the equipment without hindrance. Operation Spiderweb 2.0. Someone must answer for this. Here's why this is such a big deal. Russian bloggers and analysts are notoriously biased in their reporting. They tend to paint every event in the best possible light from the Russian perspective, constantly making out that Russia is winning the war in every metric, and downplaying any sort of resistance or counterattacks from the Ukrainians. In fact, the Kremlin has even passed laws that essentially make it illegal for bloggers or commentators to criticize or speak badly of the Russian government, its military, or its actions in Ukraine. Those who contradict this legislation can face fines, imprisonment, and other penalties. As such, most if not all of the biggest Russian voices talking about the war tend to be hugely pro-Russia. So, the fact that this Russian blogger, as well as others, was so critical in his remarks tells a very clear story. It shows that even those who have blindly supported Russia in its actions up to this point may be starting to see the cracks in the so-called special military operation. And if Russian bloggers and propaganda makers are starting to call out the military, it begs the question, what does this all mean for Putin and the current state of affairs in the Kremlin? Well, while parts of the Russian population may still believe that the war is just and Russia on the right side, many people may be slowly waking up to the reality of the situation. And that's bad news for President Putin, who has always seemed so desperate to cement himself as Russia's greatest and most respected leader. His carefully cultivated image of a strong, powerful, unflinching presence is slowly eroding as the war goes on far longer than he ever imagined, and especially now Ukraine is striking back so successfully, hitting Russian targets and breaking down the war machine bit by bit. Indeed, if the reports from this latest attack are accurate, then Russia has suffered a serious blow here. A recently published report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies detailed the colossal losses that the Russian army has suffered in recent months, stating, Russia has lost substantial quantities of equipment across the land, air, and sea domains, highlighting the sharp material toll of its attrition campaign. Since January 2024, for example, Russia has lost roughly 1,149 armored fighting vehicles, 3,098 infantry fighting vehicles, 300 self-propelled artillery, and 1,865 tanks. Even more noteworthy, Russian equipment losses have been significantly higher than Ukrainian losses, varying between a ratio of 5-to-1 and 2-to-1 in Ukraine's favor. Thanks to Spiderweb 2.0, more than a dozen more tanks and 100 armored vehicles can be added to those statistics, which really prove that, for all its military might, Russia has massively struggled to assert itself in this war. Its gains on the ground have reached a staggeringly slow pace, with just 50 meters of ground gained in some regions each day, and its losses are tremendous. And that's not just about equipment losses, but also lives, with Russia reportedly close to reaching the 1 million casualty milestone for the war so far, with an estimated 250,000 soldiers killed and hundreds of thousands more injured. If Russia continues to suffer attacks and setbacks, those losses will continue to stack up, and Putin's popularity and legacy will diminish further by the day. And there's every reason to believe that the attacks will continue, as Ukraine has really shifted the tide of the war in recent days, transitioning from defensive to offensive operations and striking deep within the heart of Russia on numerous occasions. The biggest of those strikes was, of course, Operation Spiderweb itself. That involved the use of over 100 drones to strike 4 separate air bases across Russia, including one, Belaya Air Base, which is over 2,000 miles away from the Ukrainian border. The attack took Russia and the wider world by surprise due to its incredible planning, execution, and end results, with multiple Tu-160 and Tu-22 bombers wiped out, as well as Tu-95s, which are capable of carrying nuclear bombs and cruise missiles. Ukraine has also recently struck at the Kerch Bridge, which connects the Russian mainland to the annexed and occupied Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. Russia uses this bridge to funnel vast amounts of people and supplies to and from the Crimea region, but Ukraine has repeatedly targeted it, with the latest attack involving underwater explosives. While it hasn't yet been confirmed, some analysts and experts have since suggested that Ukraine may have used advanced underwater drones to both plant and detonate those explosives, fueling fears in Russia that Ukraine could hit its naval bases, ports, and even nuclear submarines in the days and weeks to come. Recent days have also seen successful Ukrainian drone strikes on other major targets beyond its borders on Russian soil. They include the Crystal Oil Depot in the Russian city of Engels, around 370 miles away from Ukraine in the Saratov Oblast. Ukraine has targeted this depot on several occasions in the past, and the latest strike, which occurred in the early hours of June 6, was a big one. Local residents reported multiple explosions in the area, and video footage showed thick black clouds of smoke billowing above the area, with raging flames licking the skies as air raid sirens rang out in the background. The Progress factory in the Russian town of Michurinsk also bore the brunt of Ukraine's deadly drones. Reports from the scene suggested that an exploding drone caused casualties and fires, with images and videos to reinforce the claims. This factory manufactures important pieces of military hardware, including missile control systems, which allow Russia to repeatedly fire on targets in Ukraine, like civilian buildings in the country's capital city of Kyiv. One single factor unites all of these successful Ukrainian strikes: drones. For large parts of this war, Ukraine has been made to fear drones. As the invasion progressed, Russia massively ramped up its reliance on them, buying large quantities of Shahed-style drones from Iran for more than $100 billion, as well as building its own new drone production facilities, and using more and more drones with every passing year. Indeed, the first year of the war, 2022, saw around 2,600 drone strikes in total. 2024, in contrast, had around 13,800, and 2025 is projected to end with an even bigger total. Because of this, on the Ukrainian side, around 70% of all deaths and injuries are now caused by drone strikes, with both civilians and soldiers fearing the distinctive buzz of drones in the area. To make matters worse, Russia is said to be looking at ways to make its drones even more lethal and efficient, like integrating AI technologies that would allow drones to operate autonomously, without the need for human pilots or controllers. The country is also investing in drone operator training, building not just an army of drones, but an army of experts to guide them to their targets. But as Ukraine is starting to prove, and Russia is beginning to find out, two can play the drone game. Clearly, Russia is not the only country capable of using these innovative new elements of warfare to its advantage. With every passing day, Ukraine is finding new ways to push the limits of drone technology, and developing whole new attack plans and strategies built around the unique benefits that drones present. Benefits like the fact that drones are much easier to hide and covertly transport over the borders and into Russia compared to larger vehicles or groups of soldiers. Or the fact that they can deal incredible amounts of damage, despite their relatively small size. Or the fact that many of them are relatively cheap to make. The drones that Ukraine used for the spiderweb attack, for example, were said to cost just $2,000 each, yet took out billions worth of Russian hardware. In short, drones give Ukraine an ability it never had before. The ability to strike back at Russia, not just along the front lines, or in contested border regions, but far, far beyond, deep in the heart of the Russian mainland. In doing this, it sends a clear message: nowhere in Russia is safe. Ukrainian drones can and will strike far and wide across the nation. And while the Russians may try to hide their jets and other expensive hardware hundreds of miles away, there's always a chance that Ukrainian drones might be secretly smuggled to those areas, ready to strike without warning. It's not yet clear which drones Ukraine used for Spiderweb 2.0, but it's likely that they were the same or similar models to those in the first Spiderweb attack. Cheap and simple, but remarkably destructive. And if Ukraine can deal that much damage with its most basic budget drones, there's no telling what it could do with some of its more serious, advanced, and expensive hardware. Hardware like the Toloka TLK-150, TLK-400, and TLK-1000 underwater drones capable of traveling beneath the waves, through rivers, across lakes, or even over oceans and seas to strike at naval targets from below. These three drones vary in size, range, and capacity. The TLK-150, for example, is only 8 feet long and capable of traveling around 60 miles, with a maximum payload of just over 110 pounds. Meanwhile, the TLK-1000, the biggest of the trio, can measure up at almost 40 feet in length, cover distances of more than 1,200 miles, and carry payloads in excess of 11,000 pounds. A single TLK-1000 could, theoretically, take out multiple targets at once, due to its devastating power. And, on the Russian side, there are already analysts sounding the alarms about a potential attack on places like the Russian port city of Vladivostok, or the country's invaluable nuclear submarines, docked in a secure facility in the Kamchatka Peninsula in the far east stretches of Russia's territory. Speaking of sea-based drones, Ukraine has also recently revealed its incredible Magura V7 remote-controlled speedboat. Measuring 24 feet in length, this unmanned vessel can launch anti-aircraft missiles, effectively allowing Ukraine to use water-based drones to strike on aerial targets, and it's already proven successful in real-world conditions. The Ukrainian military reported that the Magura V7 took down a pair of Russian Su-30 warplanes just last month, and it represents just one of many ways in which Ukraine is investing in drone innovations and emerging technology to shape the face of not only the Russia-Ukraine war, but prospective future conflicts too. Another unifying element of Ukraine's latest attacks is the fact that they all tend to focus on key logistical or military targets across Russian territory. Ukraine has hit oil refineries, factories, airfields, railways and bridges with its drones and missiles. This is clearly a key pillar of the current Ukrainian strategy, and it's not hard to see why. Ukraine knows that even with support from Western allies, its army isn't a match for Russia's. This is clear to see in the statistics. Ukraine has around 900,000 active-duty soldiers, for example, while Russia has over 1.3 million, with more joining the cause by the day, thanks to the Kremlin's intensive recruitment drives and drafts. Russia also has far more vehicles, planes, and vessels than Ukraine. It has over 10 times as many aircraft, although many of its most important bombers were wiped out by spiderweb, as well as around 5,750 tanks and more than 130,000 armored vehicles, compared to Ukraine's estimated totals of 1,114 tanks and 18,920 armored vehicles. In many ways, this is a David versus Goliath fight. But everyone knows how that story ended, and Ukraine is proving time and time again that despite its smaller size, it's more than capable of dealing major blows to the Russian war machine. And it does this by picking its targets carefully, planning its attacks to the finest detail, and executing its strategies with impeccable precision. That's been evident in Operation Spiderweb, and now, once more, with Spiderweb 2.0. But is Spiderweb 3.0 already in the works, and where might it take place? For now, only speculation is possible, but as mentioned earlier, there are rumblings and rumors going around on the Russian side that Ukraine might make the most of its amazing underwater drones to target Russian ports or naval bases, perhaps even striking at the Russian Pacific Fleet, which is made up of various vessels, including destroyers, corvettes, and more, and check out our recent video detailing how this prospective attack might play out, or take a look at our in-depth breakdown of how the war is going, and why Russia is on the losing side at the moment. And don't forget to subscribe to the Military Show for more day-by-day updates of key events from the conflict and other important military and geopolitical news from around the globe.